A hand closed around my arm before I even understood what was happening. I was pulled off the sidewalk so fast that my bag slipped off my shoulder, and a man in a dark coat pushed me toward a black car parked at the curb. My heart slammed against my chest. I opened my mouth to shout, but another man stepped in front of me, blocking the street from view, and said only one word. Move. 10 minutes earlier, none of this made any sense. I was walking home from the library, the same way I always did, past the old brick building with the broken fountain and the row of maple trees that were just beginning to lose their leaves. That was when I heard it. A small, broken sound, coming from behind the fountain. Crying, not the loud crying of a child who wants attention, but the quiet kind, the kind that tries to hide itself. I found him curled up on the stone bench, knees pulled to his chest, a blue backpack lying open beside him with his books spilled onto the ground. He could not have been older than 7. His shoes were expensive, his coat was clearly tailored, but none of that mattered in that moment. All I saw was a child who was scared and alone. I did not ask him his name right away. I simply sat down on the other end of the bench, far enough that I would not frighten him, and I looked at the fountain instead of at him. I told him that the fountain used to work when I was his age, that water used to shoot up in 3 different directions, and that pigeons used to sit on the edge and get soaked every single time. He did not answer, but he stopped crying long enough to look at me. I kept talking. I told him about the time I fell into that very fountain when I was 9 years old, how my mother had to carry my wet shoes home in a plastic bag, how embarrassed I was for a week afterward, because my shoes made a squeaking sound every time I walked. A small laugh escaped him. It was quiet, but it was real. His name was Milo. He told me that much at least, after nearly 20 minutes of sitting together. He would not tell me why he was crying, or why he was alone, or where his parents were. Every time I asked a gentle question, he would look down at his shoes and go quiet again, so I stopped asking. Instead, I helped him gather his books back into his backpack, and I asked if he wanted me to walk with him toward home, just until he felt steady enough to go the rest of the way alone. He nodded. We walked together for 6 blocks, past the bakery on Elm Street, past the flower shop, where the owner always left a bucket of yellow tulips outside the door. Milo talked a little more as we walked. He told me he liked drawing dragons. He told me his favorite color was gray, which I thought was an unusual answer for a child, but I did not question it. He told me that his house had too many rooms and not enough people in them. That last sentence stayed with me long after he said it. I asked him, carefully, if he went to school with other children his age. He shook his head and told me a tutor came to his house every morning instead, a woman named Miss Farrow, who was strict about handwriting and did not like it when he drew dragons in the margins of his notebook. I asked if he had friends who came to visit. He shrugged, the kind of small, practiced shrug that told me the answer was no, though he did not want to say it out loud. I did not push further. Some children, I had learned over the years, tell you the truth in pieces, offering just enough to see how you react, before deciding whether to offer more. So instead, I told him about my own younger brother, about how we used to build blanket forts in our living room and pretend they were dragon caves, and how he always insisted on being the dragon, while I had to be the knight who never won. Milo laughed again at that, a real laugh this time, brighter than the one by the fountain, and for a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a 7-year-old boy, delighted by a silly story, nothing more complicated than that. We reached the end of a long stone wall, the kind that surrounds properties far larger than any house has a right to be, and Milo stopped walking. He looked up at me and said thank you, in the careful, formal way that children are taught to speak when adults are always listening. Then he turned and walked toward a gate at the end of the wall, and I stood there for a moment, watching to make sure he made it safely inside. That was when the hand closed around my arm. Now, sitting in the back seat of the black car, my bag clutched against my chest, I tried to steady my breathing. The 2 men in the front seat did not speak. The windows were tinted so dark that I could barely see the street outside, and within a few minutes, the car passed through a gate, the same gate Milo had walked through, and stopped in front of a house that looked more like something out of an old film than an actual home. Stone steps, tall white columns, windows that stretched from the ground almost to the roof. One of the men opened my door and gestured for me to step out. I did, my legs unsteady beneath me, and I was led through the front entrance into a hall with a ceiling so high it made my footsteps echo. A woman in a gray uniform stood near the staircase, watching me with an expression I could not read. Nobody explained anything. Nobody told me why I had been taken here, or what I had done wrong, if I had done anything wrong at all. I was brought into a room with dark wood shelves lined with books that looked like they had never been opened. A fireplace crackled at one end, though the evening was not cold enough to need it. And standing near the window, with his back to me, was a man in a black suit that fit him too well to be anything but expensive. He did not turn around right away. When he finally did, I felt my breath catch. He was younger than I expected, though something about his eyes made him seem older than his years. His face was calm, almost too calm, the kind of calm that made the room feel colder rather than warmer. He studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "Why were you with my son?" His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made my skin prickle. I explained everything as clearly as I could. I told him I found Milo crying near the fountain, that I sat with him until he felt better, that I only walked him home because I did not want a child that age wandering the streets alone. I told him my name, Claire Bennett, and that I worked at the community center a few blocks from where I found his son, helping children with their reading after school. He listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I began to wonder if I had said something wrong. Finally, he spoke again. "My son does not cry in front of strangers. He does not speak to strangers either. And yet you say he laughed." I told him it was true. I did not know why Milo trusted me enough to let his guard down, but he had, and I had done nothing except sit beside him and talk about pigeons and wet shoes. The man's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, though his face remained composed. He introduced himself then, Adrian Voss. I did not know the name at the time, not really, though something in the way the guard straightened when he said it told me it meant more than he was letting on. He asked me questions about myself, where I lived, where I worked, how long I had been at the community center. He asked nothing about why I had helped Milo, as though the answer to that question was somehow less important than everything else. When he was finally satisfied, he told the men to take me home. Not back to the fountain where I had been taken, but directly to my apartment, in the same black car, in complete silence. I sat in the back seat, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the span of one single evening. A crying boy, a mansion behind a stone wall, a man whose name made grown men stand a little straighter. I told myself I would never see any of them again. It seemed like the kind of encounter that happens once in a person's life and never repeats itself, a strange story to tell at dinner one day, and nothing more. I was wrong. 3 days later, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it, expecting a neighbor, or perhaps a delivery I had forgotten about, and instead found one of the same men from the black car standing in the hallway, his expression as unreadable as it had been the first time. He handed me an envelope, plain and white, with nothing written on the outside. Inside was a single card, and on it, in handwriting so precise it looked almost printed, were 7 words. "My son asked for you. Please come tomorrow." I stood in my doorway for a long time after the man left, holding that card, thinking about a boy who liked dragons and gray, and had told me his house had too many rooms, and not enough people in them. I thought about his father, standing at that window with his back to me, asking why a stranger had made his son laugh when nothing else seemed to. I did not know, standing there in my hallway, that I was about to step into a world I understood nothing about. A world where trust was rare, and danger walked through the front door as easily as guests did. All I knew, in that moment, was that a little boy needed someone, and I had never been the kind of person who could turn away from that, no matter what waited for me on the other side of that stone wall. I folded the card, placed it in my coat pocket, and began planning what I would say to my supervisor at the community center to explain why I needed the next afternoon off. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about the stone bench by the fountain, about a boy who spoke about dragons, but seemed more comfortable talking about creatures who lived alone than about his own life. I kept thinking about the vast, echoing house behind the wall, the woman in gray who watched me without speaking, and the man at the window whose calm had felt more dangerous than any shout could have been. Part of me understood, even then, that walking back through that gate would mean stepping into something far bigger than a simple act of kindness toward a crying child. But another part of me, the part that had chosen to work with children in the first place, could not stop thinking about the way Milo's face had changed when he laughed, however briefly, however far from the walls that seemed to close in around him the moment we reached his home. I set my alarm early the next morning, chose my clothes carefully, and waited by my window for the black car to arrive, my heart caught somewhere between fear and a feeling I did not yet have a name for. The next afternoon, the same black car waited outside my building at exactly 2 o'clock. I had barely stepped onto the sidewalk before the door opened for me, and I slid into the back seat with a strange mix of nervousness and curiosity twisting inside my chest. The drive back to the Voss estate felt shorter than it had 3 days earlier, though I suspected that was only because I already knew what waited at the end of it. This time, the housekeeper met me at the door instead of a guard. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hale, and though her expression was polite, there was a tightness around her eyes that told me she was choosing her words with great care. She led me through the same grand hallway, past the same closed doors, until we reached a smaller room near the back of the house, one that felt far more lived in than the study I had been taken to before. Milo was sitting on the floor with a sketchbook open in front of him, drawing what looked like a dragon curled around a mountain. When he saw me, his whole face changed. He jumped up so quickly that his pencil rolled across the floor, and for a moment, he looked like he might run toward me, the way small children run toward their parents at the end of a school day. He caught himself before he did, glancing toward Mrs. Hale as though checking whether that kind of excitement was allowed. I sat down on the floor beside him without waiting for permission, and I asked him about the dragon. He told me its name was Ash, and that Ash lived alone on the mountain because all the other dragons were scared of him, even though he never wanted to hurt anyone. I listened carefully, and something in the way Milo told that story made me wonder if he was not really talking about a dragon at all. We spent the next hour together. I helped him with a reading assignment his tutor had left for him, though it quickly became clear that Milo did not struggle with reading at all. He struggled with attention, the kind of restlessness that comes from a child who spends too much time by himself and not enough time simply being a child. When I suggested we take a short break and look out the window at the garden, his face lit up in a way that made my chest ache a little. Mrs. Hale stayed nearby the entire time, never far enough to be out of earshot, and I understood without being told that she was there to watch me as much as to watch Milo. I did not mind. I had nothing to hide, and if anything, her presence made me feel slightly less like an intruder in a house that clearly did not welcome outsiders easily. Adrian did not appear that day, though I felt his presence in everything around me. The house was too quiet. The staff moved carefully, almost silently, as though they had all learned long ago that noise was not welcome. Even Milo, for all his warmth, would sometimes glance toward the hallway when a door opened elsewhere in the house, his shoulders tensing before relaxing again when no one appeared. At one point, while we were sorting through a box of colored pencils, I asked Milo, as gently as I could, what his mother had been like. His hands stilled over the pencils, and for a long moment, he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had heard it all day. He said he did not remember much, only the smell of a certain kind of soap, and a lullaby he could hum but not name. He said Mrs. Hale sometimes hummed it too, when she thought no one was listening, and that he liked to sit near the kitchen on those mornings just to hear it. I did not ask anything further. I simply reached over and squeezed his hand once, and he let me, leaning slightly against my shoulder for the rest of the afternoon, in a way that told me the conversation, brief as it was, had meant something to him. Later, as the light outside began to shift toward evening, Mrs. Hale brought in a small tray of tea and biscuits, setting it down on the low table beside us without a word. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching Milo laugh over a drawing I had made of a very poorly rendered dragon, and something in her expression softened before she caught herself and returned to her usual careful composure. Before I left that evening, Mrs. Hale walked me to the door and told me, in a voice just above a whisper, that Mr. Voss would like me to return twice a week, if I was willing. She said it carefully, the way someone delivers an offer they are not entirely sure should be accepted. I told her I would think about it, though in truth, I had already decided the moment I saw Milo's face light up over that dragon drawing. The following week, I returned as agreed, and then again the week after that. A pattern formed quickly, one that felt strange in its normalcy, given the extraordinary way it had begun. I would arrive in the afternoon, spend 2 hours with Milo, help him with schoolwork, or simply talk with him about dragons and pigeons and whatever else crossed his mind, and then I would be driven home in the same silent black car. It was during my 4th visit that I first saw Adrian again. I had just finished helping Milo build a small tower out of wooden blocks when I heard footsteps in the hallway, slower and heavier than the light steps of the staff. Milo's head snapped up immediately, and before I could react, he was on his feet, running toward the door with an energy I had not seen from him before. Adrian stood in the doorway, still in the same kind of dark, precise suit, though his tie had been loosened, and for the first time, he looked less like the man from the study and more like someone who had simply come home from a long day. Milo wrapped his arms around his father's leg, and Adrian's hand came down to rest on his son's head, gentle in a way that surprised me given everything I had assumed about him. He looked at me over Milo's head, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. His voice was quieter than I remembered, though it still carried that same weight, the sense that every word he spoke had been considered before it left his mouth. I told him it was no trouble at all, that Milo was a wonderful boy, bright and curious, and that I looked forward to our visits. Something flickered across his face at that, something I could not quite name, surprise maybe, or something closer to disbelief that a stranger could speak so easily and warmly about his son. He asked if I would stay for dinner. It was not really a question, not in the way it was delivered, but I understood that I had a choice, and I chose to stay. Mrs. Hale set a third place at a long dining table that looked like it was built for 20 guests rather than 3, and for the first time since I had entered that house, I saw something close to a family sitting together at a meal. Milo talked more during dinner than he had during any of our previous visits combined. He told his father about the dragon story, about the reading assignment, about a bird he had seen outside the window that he was certain was the same one from a picture book Mrs. Hale had once read to him. Adrian listened to every word, asking small questions that showed he was paying real attention, though his eyes would occasionally drift toward me, as though trying to understand something he could not quite work out. At one point during the meal, Milo asked his father if dragons could ever become friends with people who used to be scared of them. Adrian paused, his fork halfway to his plate, and considered the question with a seriousness that surprised me. He said that it was possible, though it usually took a very long time, and it required the dragon to be patient, even when the people around it were still learning to trust. Milo nodded slowly, as though filing the answer away somewhere important, and returned to his meal without further explanation. I caught Adrian's eyes across the table in that moment, and something passed between us, unspoken but understood. I did not know then how much of that answer had been about dragons at all. After dinner, once Milo had been taken upstairs by Mrs. Hale to get ready for bed, Adrian walked me to the front door himself. The hallway felt different, with just the two of us in it, quieter, in a way that made the silence feel heavier rather than peaceful. He stopped near the entrance and turned to face me. "You should know something about this house," he said. "People who come here rarely leave the same way they arrived. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what you are choosing, if you choose to keep coming back." I asked him what he meant by that, though some part of me already suspected the answer would not be simple. He studied me for a long moment before he answered, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the hallway. "I have enemies," he said. "More than most men will ever have in a lifetime. My son has grown up inside walls that exist to keep him safe, not because I wanted that life for him, but because it is the only life I know how to give him. If you continue coming here, you will not be able to pretend you do not see that. And once you see it, there may be no way to simply walk away." I stood there, absorbing his words, feeling the weight of them settle over me, the way a stone settles at the bottom of still water. I thought about Milo's laugh over the dragon story. I thought about the way his shoulders tensed whenever a door opened unexpectedly. the way he had told me his house had too many rooms and not enough people in them. I told Adrian that I understood the risk, even if I did not fully understand the world he came from. I told him that Milo needed someone who would show up for him consistently, someone who would not disappear the moment things became difficult, and that I intended to be that person for as long as he needed me. Something shifted in Adrian's expression then, something small but unmistakable. He did not smile, not exactly, but the hard line of his mouth softened just slightly, and for the first time, he looked less like the feared man everyone in that house tiptoed around, and more like a father who had spent years carrying a weight he had never been allowed to put down. He walked me to the car himself that night, and as I settled into the back seat, he leaned down slightly and spoke one final sentence before stepping back to let the driver pull away. "Be careful, Claire. Not everyone will be as glad as my son that you came into this house." I did not fully understand what he meant by that warning until several weeks later, when the quiet, careful world I had stepped into began to show cracks I had not expected, cracks that revealed just how dangerous the ground beneath that beautiful house truly was. Weeks passed, and my visits to the Voss estate became something I looked forward to more than I expected. Twice became 3 times a week, and eventually, without either of us saying it out loud, my presence in that house simply became normal. Mrs. Hale stopped watching me so closely. The staff began greeting me by name. Even the guards at the gate would nod as the car passed through, as though I had earned some quiet form of approval that no one needed to announce. Milo changed too, in small ways that made my heart swell every time I noticed them. He laughed more easily. He started asking questions about the world outside the estate walls, about school, about other children his age, about things a boy his age should naturally be curious about, but had somehow learned not to ask. He began drawing more dragons, but now they were not always alone on mountains. Sometimes he drew them with other dragons beside them, flying together instead of hiding apart. One afternoon, he asked if he could invite a friend from his tutoring group to visit the estate, a boy named Oliver who shared his fascination with dragons. I brought the request to Mrs. Hale, uncertain how it would be received, but to my surprise, she said she would speak with Adrian about arranging it. 2 weeks later, Oliver arrived for an afternoon of play in the garden, and I watched from the terrace as Milo ran across the grass with another child for what Mrs. Hale quietly told me was the first time in over a year. Adrian watched too, standing beside me, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like grief for all the ordinary childhood moments his son had missed, simply by being born into this particular family. That small visit became a turning point of sorts. Milo began asking for more of them, and slowly, carefully, with security precautions I never fully understood but always respected, a few more playdates were arranged. Each one seemed to loosen something inside Milo that had been held too tight for too long, and I found myself grateful, more than I could express, to be present for that slow unfolding. It was during this time that I began to understand fragments of the world Adrian lived in, though never through anything he told me directly. I learned pieces of it through the careful silences of the staff, through the way certain names made Mrs. Hale's hands still over whatever task she was doing, through the newspapers I sometimes saw folded on side tables with headlines about businesses I now recognized as belonging, in some hidden way, to the Voss family. I learned that Milo's mother had died when he was only 3 years old. Nobody spoke about how, and I never asked. I only knew, from the way Adrian's expression would shift whenever her name came up in passing, that her loss had shaped this house in ways that went far beyond grief. It had shaped the walls, the guards, the silence, the careful distance Adrian kept from almost everyone except his son. Mrs. Hale, over time, became something closer to a friend than a mere presence in the house. She began sharing small stories with me during quiet moments, careful ones, the kind that revealed only what she judged safe to reveal. She told me that she had worked for the Voss family since Adrian himself was a boy, that she had watched him grow from a quiet, serious child into the man he had become, carrying responsibilities no child should ever have to carry so early. She told me, one afternoon, while we folded laundry together in a sunlit room near the back of the house, that she had never seen Milo laugh as freely as he did now, not since before his mother passed. She said it plainly, without dramatics, the way people speak when they have decided a truth is too important to soften. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply kept folding, letting her words settle into me the way sunlight settles into a room after a long winter. The estate itself, I slowly came to understand, functioned like its own small world. There were gardeners who tended the grounds with quiet precision, cooks who prepared meals with an attention that suggested every dish mattered, drivers who came and went at hours I never fully tracked, and guards whose faces I began to recognize, even if their names remained unknown to me. Everyone moved with purpose, and everyone, in their own way, seemed devoted to the same unspoken mission, keeping this fragile, quiet household safe. One afternoon, while Milo napped upstairs after a long morning of lessons, I found myself alone with Adrian in the study, for the first time since that very first meeting. He was reading through a stack of papers at his desk, and when I entered to return a book Milo had borrowed, he looked up and, to my surprise, asked me to sit. We talked for nearly an hour that day, about nothing important at first. He asked about my own childhood, about where I grew up, about what had led me to work with children in the first place. I told him about my younger brother, about how I used to help him with his reading when our parents worked long hours, about how something in that experience had shaped the entire direction of my life. He listened the way he always listened to Milo, fully, without distraction, as though my words mattered more than anything else he could have been doing. Slowly, the conversation shifted toward him, though he revealed things carefully, the way a man reveals only what he has decided is safe to share. He told me that he had not chosen this life, not really, that it had been placed on his shoulders the way inheritance often is, without asking whether he wanted it. He told me that everything he did now, every decision, every guard at every gate, existed for one reason only: to keep Milo safe from a world that had already taken his mother. I asked him, carefully, if he was ever afraid. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. Every single day, he said. But fear is not something a man in my position is allowed to show. If people believe I am afraid, they believe I am weak. And weakness, in my world, is an invitation. I did not know what to say to that, so I simply sat with him in the silence that followed, and for the first time, I understood that the walls around this house were not just protecting Milo. They were protecting Adrian too, a man who had built an entire life around never letting anyone close enough to see what fear actually looked like on his face. He asked me, unexpectedly, what I thought of Milo's progress since our sessions had begun. I told him honestly that Milo had grown more confident, more willing to speak his mind, more curious about the world beyond the walls of the estate. Adrian nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window, and admitted that he had noticed the same changes, but had not trusted himself to name them, worried that naming good things too early sometimes made them disappear. I told him that was not how it worked, not with children, and certainly not with the kind of steady, patient love Milo clearly received from him, despite the careful distance he kept. Adrian looked at me for a long moment after I said that, something unreadable in his expression, before he thanked me quietly, and returned his attention to the papers on his desk, though I noticed his hand did not move to turn a single page for several minutes afterward. From that day forward, our conversations in the study became a small, private ritual, tucked into the edges of my visits. Sometimes we spoke about Milo. Sometimes we spoke about nothing important at all, the kind of easy conversation that exists simply to fill a comfortable silence with something warmer. I found myself learning the small details of him the way I had learned the small details of his son, the way he preferred his coffee black and slightly too strong, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking through a difficult decision, the way his voice softened, almost without him realizing it, whenever Milo's name came up in conversation. That closeness between us continued to grow in small, quiet ways over the following weeks. He began joining Milo and me during our afternoon sessions more often, sitting in the corner of the room pretending to read, while actually watching his son laugh over stories and drawings. Sometimes he would ask me questions about parenting, awkward and careful questions from a man who clearly loved his son fiercely, but had never been taught how to show it in ordinary, gentle ways. I found myself looking forward to those moments more than I wanted to admit. There was something disarming about watching a man everyone feared sit cross-legged on the floor, struggling to build a wooden block tower taller than his son's, laughing quietly when it toppled over, before either of them could finish. But even as that warmth grew inside that house, the world outside its walls remained exactly as dangerous as Adrian had warned me it would be. I began noticing small changes around the estate, more guards at the gate than usual. Cars I did not recognize parked along the street outside for hours at a time, their drivers watching the house rather than doing anything else. Mrs. Hale grew quieter, more watchful, checking the windows more often than she used to. Even Milo seemed to sense the shift, though he could not have named what he was feeling. He grew clingier during our sessions, holding my sleeve a little tighter when it was time for me to leave. During one visit, I noticed a new guard stationed just inside the front entrance, someone I had not seen before, standing with the kind of stillness that suggested he was not there for decoration. When I asked Mrs. Hale about him, she simply said that Mr. Voss believed in being cautious and offered nothing further, though her tone told me not to press the matter. Milo, too, seemed to sense the shifting mood of the house, even if he could not name it. He began asking me, more frequently, whether I would be coming back the next day, and the day after that, as though needing repeated reassurance that our routine would continue uninterrupted. I always told him yes, and I always meant it, though a small, quiet worry had begun to settle in my own chest as well, one I could not fully explain. One evening, as I was preparing to head home, Adrian asked me to stay a moment longer. He led me into the study, and this time, his expression carried none of the softness I had grown used to seeing. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the man I had first met months earlier. "There is a man named Victor Lane," he said, without preamble. "He has been a rival of my family for many years, and recently, he has grown bold in ways he has not been before. I tell you this not to frighten you, but because I believe in honesty, and because you have become someone Milo trusts deeply. I need you to be more careful than you have been. Vary your routes. Do not travel alone if you can help it. If anything ever feels wrong, even slightly wrong, I need you to trust that instinct immediately." He explained a little more that evening than he had ever explained before, choosing his words carefully, the way a man speaks when he has decided that a certain amount of honesty is owed, even if the full truth remains too heavy to share all at once. He told me that Victor Lane controlled shipping routes along the coast that overlapped with routes the Voss family had controlled for 2 generations, and that the disagreement between them had grown from simple business friction into something far more personal over the past year. He did not elaborate on what had made it personal, and I did not ask, sensing that some doors were not yet ready to be opened, even between us. He also gave me a small device that evening, no larger than a coin, and told me to keep it in my coat pocket at all times. He explained, with the same careful precision he used for everything, that it would allow his people to locate me quickly if anything ever happened, and that I should never remove it, no matter how ordinary a day might seem. I took it without argument, understanding by then that his caution came from love rather than control, a distinction that had taken me weeks to fully recognize. I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I asked him if Milo was in danger, and his silence, longer than I wanted it to be, told me everything his words did not. "He is always in some degree of danger," Adrian said finally. "That is simply the truth of the life I was born into, and the life he was born into because of me. But lately, that danger has grown closer than I am comfortable with. I have increased security around the house. I have taken precautions you may not even notice. But I wanted you to know the truth, because you deserve to decide, with full knowledge, whether you wish to continue coming here." I thought about walking away that night. I would be lying if I said the thought did not cross my mind, sitting there in that study, with the weight of his warning settling over me like a heavy coat. But then I thought about Milo, asleep upstairs, a boy who had spent years learning that people who came into his life eventually left, one way or another. I thought about the way his face lit up every single time he saw me walk through the door, the way he had started drawing dragons flying together instead of alone. I told Adrian that I was not going anywhere. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he nodded once, as though my answer had settled something inside him that he had been unsure of. From that night forward, the atmosphere in the house shifted again, though not in a way that pushed me away. If anything, it drew Adrian and me closer together, bound by a shared understanding of what we were both trying to protect. We began speaking more openly, about Milo, about the past, about the careful walls we had both built around ourselves for very different reasons. He told me one evening that he had not felt this kind of ease around another person since before his wife had died, and the honesty in his voice when he said it left me quiet for a long time afterward. I did not fully understand, in those weeks, how quickly that fragile peace was about to be tested. I only knew that something was building outside those stone walls, something that had already begun circling closer than any of us wanted to admit, and that when it finally arrived, it would change everything about the careful, quiet world we had built inside that house. The morning it happened started like any other. I arrived at the estate a little after noon, and the guards at the gate waved the car through without their usual careful glance at the street behind us. Milo met me at the door with a drawing he had made the night before, a dragon, standing in front of a tall stone house, its wings spread wide, as though shielding the building behind it. I told him it was his best one yet, and he beamed with the kind of pride only a 7-year-old can carry so openly. We spent the early afternoon the way we always did, reading together on the floor of his room, the autumn light stretching long shadows across the carpet. Adrian had told me the week before that he would be away for part of the day, handling matters he did not explain and I did not ask about, but he had promised to be back before evening. Mrs. Hale moved through the house as usual, though I noticed she checked the hallway windows more often than she used to, a habit that had become normal enough that I barely registered it anymore. We had just finished reading a chapter of a book about a knight who was afraid of storms, and Milo had been in the middle of explaining, very seriously, why he thought the knight should simply learn to enjoy thunder instead of fearing it, when I noticed the light outside the window had changed. Clouds had rolled in faster than the forecast had predicted, casting the room in a strange, dim gray that made the walls feel closer than they usually did. It was the silence that alerted me first. Not a loud silence, but a wrong one, the kind that settles over a house when something that should be making noise suddenly stops. The guards who usually paced near the garden gate were nowhere to be seen. The staff who normally moved quietly through the halls seemed to have vanished entirely. I felt it before I understood it, a prickling unease crawling up the back of my neck. Milo felt it too. He looked up from his book, his small face suddenly pale, and asked me in a whisper why it was so quiet. I told him everything was fine, though I did not believe it myself, and I gently guided him away from the window, toward the interior of the room, my heart pounding harder with every step. I heard footsteps in the hallway then, fast and heavy, not the careful steps of the staff but something far more urgent. Mrs. Hale burst through the door, her face white, and told us we needed to move immediately. She did not explain why. She simply took Milo's hand and mine and pulled us both toward a narrow door at the back of the room, one I had never noticed before, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung open at her touch to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. We moved quickly, Milo pressed close against my side, his small hand gripping mine so tightly it almost hurt. Mrs. Hale led us down the staircase and through a stone passage that ran beneath the house, dimly lit by small bulbs mounted along the walls. I did not ask questions. There was no time for questions. I focused only on keeping Milo close, on keeping my own breathing steady enough not to frighten him further, though fear was rising in my chest, like water filling a room too small to hold it. Somewhere above us, faint and muffled through the thick stone walls, I heard sounds I could not fully identify, sharp and sudden, followed by shouting voices that cut off almost as quickly as they started. Milo flinched hard against my side at each sound, burying his face into my sleeve, and I wrapped my arm more tightly around his shoulders, murmuring softly that we were safe, that the walls around us were thick and strong, that nothing could reach us in this hidden place. Mrs. Hale's hands trembled slightly as she worked the lock on the heavy door, though her voice remained steady when she spoke, the voice of someone who had clearly been trained, at some point, for exactly this kind of moment. She told me this passage had been built years earlier, long before Milo was born, and that it had never once needed to be used until today. Something in the way she said it told me she had hoped it would remain that way forever. We emerged in a small room somewhere beneath the estate, windowless, with a single heavy door that Mrs. Hale locked behind us the moment we were inside. She pulled out a small radio from her pocket and spoke into it in a low, urgent voice. though I could not make out most of what she said. Milo pressed himself against my side, and I wrapped my arms around him, holding him the way I imagined his mother might have, had she been given the chance to grow old with him. Minutes passed like hours. Milo asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if his father was safe. I told him I did not know, but that his father was strong and careful, and that everything possible was being done to keep everyone in this house safe, including him. It was not a promise I had any right to make, but it was the only comfort I had to offer, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. To keep him calm, I began telling him a story, quietly, my voice steady, even though my hands were not. I told him about the knight from his book, the one afraid of storms, and how perhaps the reason the knight feared thunder was not the sound itself, but the memory of a storm long ago when someone he loved had been far away and out of reach. I told him that the knight learned, eventually, that storms always passed, and that the people he loved always found their way back to him, no matter how loud the thunder became. Milo listened with his face pressed against my shoulder, his small body trembling slightly less with every sentence, and by the time I finished, his grip on my hand had loosened just enough that I knew the story had done what I hoped it would. Mrs. Hale watched us from across the small room, her own hands folded tightly together, saying nothing, though her eyes carried a gratitude too heavy for words. Eventually, the radio in Mrs. Hale's hand crackled with a voice I recognized immediately, sharp and urgent even through the static. Adrian's voice, asking if Milo was safe, if I was safe. His words clipped with a tension I had never heard from him before. Mrs. Hale answered quickly, confirming that we were secure, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, though the fear did not fully leave me until, nearly 20 minutes later, the heavy door opened, and Adrian himself stepped through it. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Milo into his arms, holding him so tightly that Milo made a small sound of surprise before wrapping his own arms around his father's neck. Adrian's eyes found mine over Milo's shoulder, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that looked almost like relief, mixed with a fear he had clearly been fighting to control. He explained, later, once Milo had been settled with Mrs. Hale in another part of the house, what had happened. Victor Lane had grown tired of waiting, and had sent men to test the estate's defenses, hoping to reach Milo as a way of striking at Adrian without confronting him directly. The attempt had failed, thanks to the security Adrian had quietly built up over the previous weeks, but it had come far closer to succeeding than either of us wanted to think about. I asked him, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to, what would happen now. He was quiet for a long moment, standing near the window of the study with his back to me, the same way he had stood during our very first meeting all those months ago. Now, he said finally, I make sure this never happens again. There was something in his voice that frightened me, not because I thought he would hurt me, but because I understood, for the first time with total clarity, exactly what kind of man he truly was outside the walls of that house. A man capable of protecting the people he loved by any means necessary. A man whose reputation had not been built on rumor alone. I did not judge him for it. I could not after watching him hold his son the way he had, not after seeing the fear in his eyes when he thought, even for a moment, that he might have lost the one person in the world he loved without condition. But I understood, standing in that study with the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me, that I had stepped fully into a world where danger was not a distant possibility. It was a constant, quiet presence, waiting at the edges of every ordinary afternoon. I asked him about Victor Lane, about why a man would go to such lengths over whatever conflict existed between them. Adrian explained, carefully and without excusing any of it, that old business rivalries in his world rarely stayed contained to boardrooms and negotiations. Territory, reputation, and pride became tangled together over years, until the original disagreement barely mattered anymore, only the ongoing struggle to avoid appearing weak. He said Victor had once been someone his own father had trusted, decades earlier, before a betrayal neither side had ever forgiven. He told me, too, that he had spent years trying to keep Milo insulated from all of it, building walls both literal and otherwise, hoping his son could grow up believing, for as long as possible, that the world was simply a place of dragons and storybooks and gardens full of quiet afternoons. Today had proven how fragile that hope truly was, and the admission seemed to cost him something deep, judging by the way his shoulders dropped slightly as he said it. He turned to face me then, his expression softer than before, though exhaustion had carved deep lines into his face that had not been there that morning. "You could still leave," he said quietly. "I would not stop you, and I would not think less of you for it. What happened today was because of my world, not yours, and you never asked to be part of it." I thought about Milo, asleep somewhere upstairs after everything he had been through that day, a boy who had already lost one parent to a danger he could not understand, and who had spent the last several months slowly learning to trust the world again because of the time we had spent together. I thought about Adrian, standing in front of me, with more honesty in his eyes than I had ever seen from him, offering me a way out even though I could see, clearly, how much he did not want me to take it. I told him I was not leaving. I told him that fear was not a good enough reason to walk away from people who needed me, and that I had never been the kind of person who ran from difficulty simply because it was difficult. I told him that whatever this world was, whatever dangers it carried, I had already chosen to be part of Milo's life, and by extension, part of his. Adrian crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that I could see every line of exhaustion and relief on his face. He did not say anything for a long moment, and then, quietly, he thanked me, in a voice that carried more weight than any of his usual careful words ever had. Before I left that evening, I looked in on Milo one final time. He was asleep, finally, his small chest rising and falling steadily beneath his blanket, one hand still curled loosely around the edge of his pillow, the way it always was when he slept deeply. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, feeling a fierce protectiveness settle over me that I had not fully expected to feel this strongly for a child who was not, by any measure, my own. Adrian appeared beside me quietly, his footsteps softer than I expected from a man his size, and together we stood there in the doorway, watching his son sleep, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. After a while, he reached over and gently took my hand, not with any grand gesture, but simply holding it, as though needing the reassurance of contact after everything the day had demanded of him. I let him. That night, as the car drove me home through streets that suddenly felt far more dangerous than they had that morning, I understood that everything between us had changed. Not just the trust that had built slowly over months, but something deeper, something neither of us had spoken aloud yet, though I suspected we both felt it settling into place, undeniable and quietly permanent, in the space between fear and everything that had almost been lost. 3 weeks passed before the estate felt like itself again. The extra guards remained, quieter now, more disciplined in their positions, but the tense, breathless quality that had filled the house in the days following the attempted attack slowly began to fade. Milo, remarkably, seemed to recover faster than any of us expected. Children, I had learned over the years, often carry a resilience adults forget they once had, and within days, he was back to drawing dragons and asking me questions about pigeons and clouds and whatever else crossed his curious mind. But something had shifted permanently beneath the surface of that recovery. Milo held my hand more often now, even during simple moments that did not call for it, as though reassuring himself that I was still there. He asked, more than once, if I would always come back, and each time, I told him the truth. I told him that as long as he wanted me there, I would keep coming back, no matter what. Mrs. Hale told me, quietly one afternoon, that Victor Lane's men had been dealt with in a way that would keep the family safe for the foreseeable future, though she offered no further detail, and I did not ask. I understood by then that some parts of Adrian's world would always remain behind a curtain I was not meant to look fully behind, and I had made peace with that boundary in a way that surprised even me. Trust, I had come to learn, did not require complete knowledge. It only required a steady belief in a person's character, built slowly over many small moments, rather than granted all at once. The guards who remained around the estate grew familiar to me over those weeks, no longer strangers in dark coats but quiet fixtures of daily life, men who nodded politely when I arrived and asked, sometimes, how Milo's newest drawing had turned out. Even the atmosphere of the house itself seemed to soften, The heavy silence of earlier months replaced gradually by something closer to ordinary quiet, the kind that exists in any home where people feel safe enough to simply exist without constant vigilance. Adrian changed too, though in quieter, less obvious ways. He began joining us for nearly every visit instead of only some of them, setting aside whatever work waited in his study to sit on the floor with his son, to listen to stories about dragons who were no longer alone on their mountains. He asked me, one afternoon, while Milo napped, if I would consider staying for dinner more regularly, not as an occasional gesture, but as something closer to routine. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Our dinners became something I looked forward to more than I wanted to admit to myself. Milo would talk endlessly about his day, and Adrian would listen with the same careful attention he gave to everything involving his son, though I noticed, more and more, that his eyes would drift toward me throughout the meal, lingering a beat longer than simple politeness required. I found myself doing the same, and neither of us spoke about it directly, though the air between us had grown warmer with every passing week, charged with something neither of us seemed ready to name aloud. One evening, after Milo had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie the three of us had been watching, Adrian carried him upstairs himself, refusing Mrs. Hale's offer to help, and when he returned, he sat beside me instead of across from me for the first time. We talked long into the night about small, unimportant things, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized I had stopped thinking of the estate as his house, and had begun, quietly, to think of it as somewhere I belonged. He walked me to the car that night the way he always did, but instead of the usual brief goodbye, he lingered at the door a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the frame of the car, as though reluctant to close the distance between us just yet. Neither of us said anything about it directly, but the moment stretched long enough that the driver eventually cleared his throat gently, and Adrian stepped back, a small, rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he wished me a safe drive home. It was Milo, in his usual straightforward way, who finally said what neither of us would. We were sitting in the garden one evening, the three of us, watching the last light of the day fade behind the stone wall that surrounded the estate. Milo was drawing in his sketchbook, his tongue poking slightly out of the corner of his mouth, the way it always did when he concentrated hard, and without looking up, he asked if I was going to be his new mother. The question landed in the quiet evening air like a stone dropped into still water. I did not know what to say, and beside me, I felt Adrian go very still. I opened my mouth to give some careful, gentle answer meant to soften the moment, but before I could speak, Adrian answered for both of us. "I would like that very much," he said quietly, "if Claire is willing." Milo looked up at me then, his eyes wide and hopeful in a way that made my chest ache with a feeling too large to name. I looked at Adrian, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any doubt behind the words he had just spoken so plainly in front of his son. I found none, only quiet, steady certainty, the same certainty he carried in everything he did when it came to protecting the people he loved. I told them both, my voice unsteady with emotion, I had not expected to feel so strongly, that I would like that too. The following months brought changes I could never have imagined on the day I first found Milo crying behind that broken fountain. Adrian and I grew closer, slowly and carefully, the way two people build something meant to last rather than something built for a fleeting moment. He remained, in many ways, the same guarded, careful man I had first met in that study, but with me, and with Milo, the walls he had built around himself for so many years continued to soften, piece by piece, until the man beneath them became someone I had grown to care for more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone. The danger that had once felt so distant to me never fully disappeared. I understood, by then, that it never truly would. Victor Lane remained a threat somewhere beyond the estate walls, and Adrian's world continued to carry risks that would never belong to an ordinary life. But I also understood something else, something that had taken root slowly over the months since that first crying afternoon by the fountain. Love, real and steady, does not wait for danger to disappear before it grows. It grows anyway, quietly, stubbornly, finding space between the fear and the uncertainty, and making a home there regardless. Milo continued to flourish in ways that filled me with quiet pride every single day. His drawings grew more elaborate, his dragons no longer hiding on mountains but flying together in wide, open skies, surrounded by other dragons who no longer feared them. He laughed more easily, spoke more openly, and slowly stopped flinching at unexpected sounds the way he once had, replaced instead by a steadiness that came from finally believing, deep down, that the people around him were not going anywhere. I began teaching him more than reading during our afternoons together. We started small science experiments with things found around the kitchen, baking soda and vinegar volcanoes, that left Mrs. Hale sighing over the mess, but smiling all the same. We planted seeds in small pots along the windowsill of his room, and Milo checked them every single morning with the kind of devoted patience only a child can bring to watching something grow so slowly. When the first green shoot finally appeared, he ran through the house to find his father, pulling him by the hand all the way upstairs just to see it, and Adrian knelt beside the windowsill for nearly 10 minutes, examining the tiny plant with the same seriousness he might give an important business matter. Adrian began attending some of Milo's tutoring sessions as well, not out of suspicion the way he might have in the earliest days, but simply because he wanted to be present. He was, I discovered, surprisingly good at mathematics, and he and Milo would sometimes race through simple problems together, Adrian pretending to lose on purpose, just to hear his son's triumphant laughter fill the room. One evening, nearly a year after that first afternoon by the fountain, Adrian asked me to walk with him through the garden after Milo had gone to sleep. The autumn air was crisp, the same season it had been when I first found a crying boy hiding behind a broken stone fountain, though everything about my life had changed so completely since then that it felt like remembering a different lifetime entirely. He stopped near the same spot where Milo had asked his question months earlier, and he turned to face me, something quietly nervous in his expression that I had rarely seen from a man who carried himself with such careful control in every other part of his life. He told me that he had spent years believing that love was something he had lost the right to, that the life he led made it impossible to offer anyone the kind of safety and peace they deserved. He told me that watching me with Milo, watching the careful way I had chosen to stay, even after understanding exactly what danger meant in his world, had changed something in him he had thought was permanently closed off. He asked me to stay. Not simply for Milo's sake, though that reason remained as strong as ever, but for his own. He asked if I would consider building a life with both of them, fully, permanently, with all the risks and all the quiet joys that life would carry. He told me that he understood what he was asking, that choosing him meant choosing a life with guards at the gate and careful precautions around every ordinary outing, a life that would never be simple in the way most people expected their lives to be. He said he would understand completely if that was too much to ask of anyone, but that he had spent long enough pretending he did not want to ask it at all, and he could not keep pretending any longer. I did not need to think long before answering. I had already chosen, months earlier, standing in that hidden room beneath the estate with Milo's small hand gripping mine, that I was not the kind of person who walked away from people who needed me, and somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it was happening, I had also chosen Adrian, chosen the careful, guarded man who had slowly let down his walls one quiet moment at a time. I told him yes. Life with them was never simple after that. There were still guards at the gate, still careful precautions taken with every outing, still moments when the shadow of Adrian's world crept close enough to remind me that safety was never guaranteed, only carefully protected. But within those walls, something had grown that I never expected to find on the day I first sat beside a crying boy near a broken fountain. A family, imperfect and unconventional, built from grief and fear, and quiet, stubborn love, but a family nonetheless. I thought often, in the quiet moments before sleep, about how strange the path had been that led me here. A simple walk home from the library, a small sound behind a broken fountain, a decision to sit rather than walk past. I could not have known, in that moment, that a single act of kindness toward a crying child would rearrange the entire shape of my life. But looking back, I would not have changed a single step of it, not even the frightening parts, not even the moments when danger felt close enough to touch, because every one of those steps had led me toward two people who had become, without my ever fully planning it, the center of everything that mattered to me. Milo continued to draw his dragons, flying together now in skies wide enough to hold every one of them. And in the evenings, when the three of us sat together in that garden, watching the light fade behind the stone walls that had once felt like a prison and now simply felt like home, I understood something I had not fully understood on that first afternoon by the fountain. Sometimes the most feared people in the world are not feared because of what lives inside their hearts, but because of everything they have had to carry alone in order to protect the people they love. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is one person willing to sit quietly beside them and stay.